In this show, we talk to Chris Hirst, who runs one of the world's largest creative networks and is the author of No Bullshit Leadership. In it, he seeks to overturn what he calls the leadership industrial complex that overcomplicates what leadership is and prevents the core role and practices of what leaders really need to do from being explicit.
Hi, friends, and welcome back to the Evolving Leader Podcast. I'm Scott Allender, and with me, as always, is my co-host, John Gomes.
How are you feeling, Scott?
I'm feeling energized already today by the guest that we have. So how are you feeling?
Well, I am really looking forward to talking to Chris. We've known each other for quite a long time. It's over a decade, and he is one of the sharpest thinkers I've ever met. So yeah, it's going to be good.
Why don't you tell us about him, John?
Yeah, well, today we are joined by Chris Hirst. He is the global CEO for Havas Creative Network. It's a multidisciplinary marketing services group, and he was previously the CEO at Grey London, where we worked together, and he's also the author of No Bullshit Leadership. Now, the minute you put together that job title with an advertising executive, I'm sure all sorts of assumptions are going through your mind. They did with me, actually, funnily enough, even though I know Chris very well. But by the end of this interview, I'm convinced you'll take away some of the most clear-sighted thinking on leadership you've ever heard. So, Chris, welcome.
Hi, guys. Thank you for having me. Delighted to be here. By the way, that is exactly what and this is going to sound like a humble brag. I'm halfway into the sentence and I'm regretting it, but and it's not meant to be. That is exactly what the Financial Times said. They said, I'm not sure what to think about a book on leadership written by somebody who works in advertising. So, yeah. There we go.
Hi, Chris. Welcome to the show. Can you tell us a little bit about your career so we can get some context about your experiences before we dive into your book?
Yeah, sure. So my sort of adult career, let's say, I've spent entirely in advertising agencies. But my first job actually was in a factory. My first job was I spent a year working in a glass factory in the industrial northwest of England in a place called St Helens. But since leaving university, yeah, I've worked in creative agencies, essentially working my way up from an account executive, working on Unilever and the like. I worked at a couple of very, very good agencies. They were the best in their day. They were the best, BBH and Fallon. If you know anything about creative agencies, you'll certainly know those names. I then had a long stint at a WPP agency called Grey, which John just mentioned, which was, I think, very good at times and very bad at times. I suppose we might come and talk about the learnings from both. And I am now the global CEO of Havas Creative Network, which is a French-run and global advertising agency network, actually owned by the Vivendi Group, which may or may not be familiar to your listeners, but an interesting business to be part of.
So let's, before we get into the book, talk about what you did at Grey, because that was pretty astounding. In the midst of the last economic recession, you took that agency from a leadership position from a place where it was called as Grey as its name, to becoming one of the most successful agencies in the world. Can you just walk us through some of the key steps there? I know it's a big story, but tell us the potted version of it.
Yeah, I'll try and do a potted version. I was there for about 13 years, I think, in the end, and I think the arguably the most interesting half of my experience at Grey was actually the first half, which was an unmitigated disaster. So I was hired as part of a hot shot turnaround team by a new hotshot CEO, and I was very young. Everybody else, there was 4 of us plus the CEO. There was 5 of us. We were all very young. Within, it was a big sort of song and dance, big razzmatazz. Within 6 months, the CEO, my boss, I was the MD, had been fired. And that's a whole separate story in itself. Within about 18 months. Everybody else who I'd been hired with had left, and it is important for me to say at this point, have subsequently gone on to absolutely stellar careers. So they lost nothing from leaving, and I stayed. And it's quite an interesting. Well, I think it's quite an interesting point to discuss why I did. But 6 years later, I was still there. I'd been passed over at least twice as to be the CEO. So I was still sort of the number two in this agency. The agency, you were quite polite about it, John. I mean, the agency was a dog of a business still. And honestly, if you're brought in, you after 6 years, you can no longer be part of the solution. You become part of the problem if you haven't done anything. So I was without question part of the problem, and they were probably right to pass me over. And to try and condense it down, I suppose you make a bit of your own luck, but got a bit of luck. And two things happened. One, they hired the David Patton, who's the person who you and I, how we know each other, in fact, John, as another new boss for me. And at this point, I thought, I've read the writing on the wall here. I mean, it's nothing personal, but I think I get the message that I got to go and do something else. But I basically talked them into letting me go and spend 8 weeks at the AMP program at Harvard, which is effectively a mini MBA. And again, that's a long story how I managed that. And it's no exaggeration to say that changed my life. And it changed my life not in the ways that you would expect me to say, I think, when we talk about business schools. And in fact, I'm a bit rude about business schools in my book. But because the way that program worked is it physically separated you, like physically, I was in Boston. It physically separates you from everything in your life, your friends, your family, your job. It's a 6-day-a-week, 14-hour-a-day course. And what I realized was you walk into a room, nobody knows who the hell you are, nobody knows the name of the company you work for. And in fact, you can be anybody you want to be in that room. And all the things that are holding you back, you realize most of it's just stories in your head. It's just stuff you're telling yourself. And when that stuff suddenly physically isn't there, you feel an astonishing sense of liberation. Certainly I did. And it really quite profoundly changed me. And at the point that I came back, David, who I just mentioned, actually got promoted, and he gave me a shot as CEO. And so within about 6 months, I'd come back from this program. I suddenly do find myself in this CEO role. And I suppose I and the team I was with, if I had to summarize our strategy at that point, it wasn't so much that we knew exactly what we were going to do, but we were absolutely crystal clear what we weren't going to do. And that was, I was absolutely determined I was not going to repeat any of the mistakes I had made and I had seen others make during that preceding 6 years. Now, eventually you have to have something more positive to build on as well, but that was the start.
So what story were you telling yourself when you stayed at that job for 6 years?
Well, that's a good question. I think that I was partly telling myself a story that it's okay, it's getting better this time next year, we'll sort it out. And we're only just one small step away. Eventually all the pieces, it's all bad luck, and eventually the pieces will just fall into place. So I think there was a sort of a somewhat unwarranted sense of, I don't even know whether it was optimism. I think it's something slightly less positive than optimism, almost denial, possibly. I also think that I was scared to leave. I mean, I think that's the honest answer. I don't think I stayed for good reasons. I don't think I stayed because I felt like, I'm going to stick it out. I'm not going to give in. I think if somebody had come along and waved a magic wand, I think during those 6 years, if I'm really honest, I think I'd be really hard of leapt at the chance to go and do something else. But right. I think I was scared to step out. It was kind of that classic sort of frog in warming water, right? It was comfortable-ish, or at least more comfortable than I feared being outside would be.
But that sense of liberation that you experienced, I'm guessing it somehow led to this breakthrough idea you came up with, you and the team, of Open, because that was disruptive and transformational.
It definitely did. I think in a way, at that point, the first thing to say is, it for sure wasn't just me. I think it's true of all businesses. It's certainly true of our business that you cannot achieve anything on your own. You have to first and foremost build your leadership team. But I think as a team, all of us in a way had some sense of real deep dissatisfaction with experiences we'd had in businesses, agencies elsewhere. And we kind of came together with this shared sense of more than dissatisfaction, almost anger in some ways as to our personal experiences in those businesses. And a lot of that boiled down to a very autocratic, top-down, command and control structure that we'd all kind of been on the receiving end. And I think David, who was my boss at that point, I think he'd had it on the receiving end as a client from agencies as well. And I think in different ways, we all discovered that we had this, whatever we do, we don't want it to look like that. You know, we absolutely believe. And I think that turned into to open, which was the word we used to describe our culture. And I think open itself, I mean, if you Google open culture, you get about 150 million hits. Okay. So I don't think the insight that we had was necessary, certainly wasn't ours, and nor was it particularly revolutionary. I think what we did though was we actually did it. And I think that's, you know, one of my things about ideas is I think ideas are easy, honestly. We can all have ideas all the time. What is really difficult is choosing the right idea and then executing it brilliantly. And what we recognized was, partly through trial, partly through error, was that open is a description of the organizational culture that we wanted. And when people asked us what our, you know, what's your turnaround strategy? We'd say our strategy is our culture, and we'd mean it. You know, our strategy was, how do we build a really effective organizational culture? And in simple terms, for us, open was whatever we could do that tangibly demonstrated the opposite of that command and control, top-down, autocratic culture. So we actively set about pulling apart, pulling down, smashing up anything we saw and came across that we felt contributed towards that. And also, I think this is without question true of all cultures in all organizations everywhere, we recognize that the culture, whatever you actually say, what culture really is the behavior of management. And I think that the reason that culture is one of those words that there's an awful lot of cynicism around, I think, in an organizational sense. And I think for me, cynicism exists in the gap between what you say and what you do. And in a lot of organizations, the reason there's cynicism about when the organization talks about culture is because there's this yawning gap between when you go to the organization's website and read what it claims its culture is, and people's specific experiences within that organization. And so if the way you deal with the culture is you just close the gap between what you say and what you do. You say, this is what we believe our culture is going to be. We will be very clear about what our behaviors as a leadership should be to create and support that culture. And by the way, we will work hard to hold ourselves to account, and we want you to hold us to account to that. Because we're all human, right? I mean, we all do dumb things sometimes. We all say things, we all get angry when we shouldn't. But the point is there somebody there to say, hang on a minute, you know, don't be a dick. You know, are the people around you that you're going to listen to, that you're going to take advice from, that you're going to take feedback from? Because if you believe your success is the culture, I think that's just fundamental. You can't do it without that.
Just give us the headlines in terms of what that led to in terms of business performance, because it was quite astonishing.
Yeah, I mean, the business I think it was probably about during a 3 or 4 year period, the business in London was probably, when we took over, something like a £20 million revenue business, and 4 years later it was something like 55 million, and the margin would have gone from something like medium single digits, 6 or 7%, to north of 20%. But it wasn't just, you know, I mean, of course that matters hugely. That's what businesses are there to do, to deliver growth and profit. But I think we did that through producing substantially better work. I mean, I think the two were symbiotic, actually, though. What we said was, and what we were very proud of, I think, certainly for those that don't know, I suppose our business is commercial creativity, let's say. I think a lot of people even within advertising see some sort of tension between those two, between, you know, can you be big and creative? You know, to be creative, do you have to be small? And we said, absolutely not. We don't think there's a tension between those two at all. In fact, we believe that the more clients we have, the more opportunities, the more interesting briefs we have, the more opportunity we have to do fantastic work. We want to embrace that. And the whole point of one of the things we said explicitly about the cultural point was, we believe as a successful creative business, we need to be able to have a culture that embraces all sorts of different types of clients with all sorts of different needs and biorhythms and pace and scale. And I think that's one of the things that's very difficult to achieve in an autocratic top-down culture. You end up with effectively a single way of being, a single way of thinking, a single way of behaving, and that is the way that the one person at the top literally dictates that it should be.
Okay, so let's turn to the book. What problem is No Bullshit Leadership solving?
The problem it is solving is, I think there is a what I refer to as a leadership industrial complex that makes a vast billions and billions and billions of dollars out of the subject of leadership. And what I refer to, if it is a word, as the complexification of the subject of leadership. And, we know what that industry is. That industry is business schools and consultants and offsite training programs and books. So, we're kind of all in that, right? And I think that the problem with this is it creates this sense that leadership is this elite and kind of exalted knowledge that's only open and available to a chosen few. And my argument is that everybody has the potential to lead, first of all. And second of all, the subhead of the book is why the world needs more everyday leaders and why that leader is you. And because my premise is that everybody who has people that they are responsible for is a leader, whether that be 2 people or 20,000 people. And yet, typically when we talk about leaders, we still, default to CEOs, generals, dot-com billionaires, et cetera, et cetera. And yet there's a vacuum, we need, I wrote this 2 years ago. This is more true than ever. We need more better leaders in our hospitals, in our schools, in our, music companies, in our advertising agencies. And we need those leaders throughout our business. And the problem that the book is solving is this complexification, I think, causes 2 issues. The first is it inhibits all of these people who are already in leadership positions from fulfilling their potential. And secondly, and I think potentially worse, it excludes huge swathes of our society from ever thinking leadership is something that they could aspire to. So that it's solving those 2 problems, I think.
Okay, so let's just walk through some of the big ideas, because you're incredibly passionate about simplifying what the role of a leader is. Just walk us through some of the big building blocks of your thinking around that.
Well, I think the first thing is to establish that what leadership is. And for me, leadership is the navigation of a group of people from a defined state in the present to a different and clearly defined state that exists in the future. So leadership is by definition for me about change. And I think I always say to people, if you can remember just 2 words when it comes to the subject of leadership, because as I've said, there's a whole lot of blah about it. But if you just remember 2 words, and those words are clarity and action, then you're not going to go too far wrong. And even more than that, because I don't know if I said I did a degree in engineering, basically, and therefore I'm this kind of weird person that quite enjoys maths. Most people's eyes glaze over when it comes to equations. I quite like equations. So I thought I'll write an equation, right? So I said, well, okay, let's talk about leadership impact. Leaders want to create impact. So let's say we want to create impact. How do we define what that is? Well, for me, leadership impact is clarity multiplied by action. And for me, clarity is all the things that they talk about. I somewhat dismissively originally called it business school stuff, and I don't intend to be dismissive, but that's all the things we talk about normally when we talk about leadership. So that's missions and visions and values and purpose and strategy, and all those things are important. But then you multiply clarity by action. And the point of my slightly cod equation is, no matter how fabulous your strategy is, if your action is zero, your impact is zero. So leadership doesn't begin until you're creating action, till you're doing. Leadership is a doing word, not a thinking word in my mind. And I think the other point really about my cod equation is that actually it biases towards action. So what it says is, even if your strategy, let's say, is imperfect, if you bias towards action, you're still going to create impact. And in fact, the reality is, of course, is your strategy is going to be imperfect. I mean, it is. I mean, one of my favorite quotes, Mike Tyson, everybody has a plan till they get punched in the face. I mean, that's my equation read in tooth and claw. Okay. So leadership is about clarity and action. And I think I'd make one other observation about that. I think the way to break that down is to think to yourself, imagine a start point. Okay, so if leadership is about action, is about a journey, the first thing you have to do is define a start point. And so this is a simple definition of the problem you're trying to solve as a leader. Now, the leadership industrial complex will sell you a ton of consultancy to help you answer that question. Buy that if you like, but it's not a difficult question to answer. It's if you want to understand the biggest challenge a retailer has, go and talk to the person that works on the checkout. It's that, okay? So define that. The key there is to be honest, is to be able to be honest about the problem. Not always easy, be honest. The second point is, where are you trying to get to? And this is visions, values, purposes, BHAGs, all that kind of stuff. And we are told as leaders that coming up with a really clever answer to where you want to get to is the defining task for a leader. And I say bullshit. For me, that also isn't a very difficult question, and don't treat it as a difficult question. And the problem a lot of leaders have is they've been told that coming up with a really clever answer to that question is almost a sign of leadership virility. And I've been part of leadership teams, I'm sure many others have too, where they've become so obsessed with the answer to that question, they've never actually got beyond trying to answer it. Whereas in actual fact, we've all been on those offsites, right? Where you all get into that group think, you come up with an answer at the end of the day, you get back into work on the Monday and you can't even agree what it is you all came up with. And then you try and explain it to somebody who wasn't in the room and they go, what? And we've all been there. And I think part of that is because we've been told to search for uniqueness, whereas in reality, the vast majority of businesses are just trying to do a common thing better than the competition. And so, if you've got something unique, just write it in there, move on. But most businesses don't. So that's just a direction. Don't aim for a pinhead, aim for a direction. You can always review that as you go. But neither of those two things are leadership. Those aren't leadership. Leadership is how you get between those 2 points. So I suppose those two are your clarity, but the leadership is the action, and action is getting between the two.
One of the other points you make is to dispel the myth that there are natural-born leaders. You say that leadership, like any skill, is a muscle that needs to be strengthened through practice, that developing it is essentially a discipline. John and I obviously agree with that, or we wouldn't be doing this podcast. But can you give us your take on that? What does it take to build that muscle? And in your estimation, why do some succeed and others don't?
Well, I got a couple of observations to make around that. I mean, the first thing is that I think anything that we practice at, we get better at. We could all three of us now, sit and take up the clarinet or something, right? And in a year's time, we're going to be better at the clarinet if we practice than we are now. That's just a fact. And I think that is also true of leadership. Now, it's also true, however, that one of us might have a particular gift for it and we might be better than the others. And I think that's also true of leadership. Some people just, a combination of the task they are leading within and their personality and all various other things might mean they outperform. But nevertheless, the fundamentals of leadership, and what I try to do in my book is explain what I think those are by the demystification, the wiping away of the bullshit. I think it is possible to give anybody tools to enable them to be a better leader and to help them have a path to improve their leadership skills. That's my basic premise. The only other thing I'd say is that it wasn't until I got the title of a CEO that I actually thought of myself as a leader, which is, of course, the opposite of the argument I'm now making. And I suppose what I feel is that, of course, I would like everybody to agree with my view on leadership. But my advice to any leader is the most important thing is that you do have a conscious point of view on what you think leadership is about and what what your particular leadership style, what you'd either like it to be or what you'd like it to develop into. And whereas I think a lot of people in leadership positions, even very senior leadership positions, don't really consciously think about that at all, or they certainly aren't able to particularly express what they think, what they think leadership is. And I think that's a problem. And if that is a central tenet of what your role is, and you can't describe your philosophy around it or how you're trying to do it, I think that's for most people, I think a problem, because then how do you develop? How do you identify the areas where you need to learn?
Yeah, that makes so much sense. I 100% agree with what you're saying, that cultures are what you do, not what you say. And you talk a bit about culture specifically in the space of how many organizations are kind of in a parent-child or a dependent culture. Can you tell us about that and what's the antidote?
So I referred to this kind of top-down approach. I mean, I think that essentially top-down cultures are dependent cultures. I mean, they can be in an autocratic style or a sort of a more benevolent style than that. But the problem with it is that all of our organizations are full of, very well educated, by and large, highly motivated, by and large, and comparatively, often either comparatively or in absolute terms, very well paid people, all of whom, or the vast majority of whom, have a very strong point of view and are ambitious to try and solve the challenges that they face every day. I think the problem with dependent cultures or top-down cultures is that really what the effect that those cultures have on the people within them is it says, at the end of the day, it doesn't really matter what you think. It only really matters what the person ultimately the top of the chain thinks, and everybody else really is there to try and deliver that person's ideas. Now, if you're in a company of 10, an organization of 10 people, that might, if you have the right person at the top, that might work quite effectively in an organization of 10 people. Most of it, by the way, I still think if you're one of the people in the organization, it's an incredibly frustrating space to be. But if you're the person at the top, it might work for you. I think the problem is once you get to an organization of any size, and actually I think it would be very frustrating with just in a small company as well, is that the net capability of your organization is less than the sum of the parts. You are actively stifling the ideas, the ambition, the input of the people there. And
right.
And what you really want is you want the opposite of that. You want an organization that is greater than where greater than the sum of the parts. And you can only do that by finding a culture that liberates people to find their own solutions, to speak up, to succeed and fail within some sort of safe parameters on their own. And I think that is what great organizations have always done and always found their way to do. And of course, the other thing is, and this is a slightly more, I don't know, this may be a slightly more subjective observation, but instinctively I feel that maybe once upon a time, one of the reasons that our organizations were structured the way they were, which was, it was typical to be very top down and autocratic. And that's because our organization structures basically came out of, after the Second World War, everybody in the Western world had been in the military, and they all came out of military structures, and they formed organizations that looked like the military. I mean, that's what happened. But now I think we find ourselves in a place where people just won't tolerate that anymore. People just will not tolerate working in organizations like that, and will rail against it, and at the very least will sort of passively and miserably accept it. And if I think back to my time when we came together at Grey, it was really that organizational structure, that cultural approach that we most railed against and tried so hard to find an alternative.
So what would an organization have to do if they have that top-down parent-child culture and they want to change it, but it's ingrained? What do they have to do how do they blow it up and start over?
Well, so people often say to me that cult, people say, yeah, but culture is really hard to define, isn't it? And and even when you defined it, it's hard to change. And I don't think either of those things are true. I think, let's say you join a new company, okay, and you've read the website, so you know what it says the culture is, and you turn up on day one. Mm-hmm. If you want to know what the actual culture in that organization is, a great rule of thumb is to sit. Well, obviously, this is in the days where we used to actually be able to go into the office. But if you sit next to the person next to you and say, what do you have to do to get on around here? And the answer to that question is a really good rule of thumb about what that culture really cares about. So it is actually quite easy to find out what the real culture is like. I think about culture like concrete. Okay, so if you imagine when you're pouring concrete, right? You set the mold out, you pour the concrete, it's where it runs into the mold, and while it's setting, you can sign your name in it with your finger, and cats walk across it and leave paw prints. But over time, it sets, and that's how culture goes. Now, if you want to change that culture, you can change it, but it's not a soft, squishy thing. It's not about whether you have free fruit at lunchtimes. To change that culture, you have to do hard physical things. You have to smash it, and to create any change, you have to ideally express to people the thing you are aspiring to. You have to explain, like, you follow my journey that I just talked about. You have to say, where are we today? This is the culture that I think we have today, and I think this culture is wrong, and blah, blah, blah. This is where we want to be, and these are the steps we're going to take to get there. So the first thing I think is I think we're all quite uncomfortable with change. One of the ways of dealing with that is to explain to people why you're doing what you're doing, and explain to them as individuals what's in it for them to go through that painful process to get to the end point. So that's the first sort of, if you like, basic piece. But as I said, that's not leadership. The leadership is the doing. And so I think you have to identify the things that you consider to be totems of that culture. And I'll give you an example that is not an example that you find typically in business books. And that is, I think, seating plans. I think you can understand an awful lot about an organizational culture by its seating plan. If you walk in, you can say, okay, how do people organize themselves in this space? Has everybody got an office? Yes or no? Do people have assistants that sit outside their office? Yes or no? How is it divided? Do they sit in departments? Do they sit around client teams? Do they sit based on hierarchies? Is there an executive floor? Whatever it is. And also the thing with seating plans is people are really attached to them. So if you want to change if you want to reset how your organization feels, changing how you organize where people sit or where they congregate when they come into your business is an incredibly powerful way of changing how people interact with each other. And it's also an incredibly powerful way of making signals about control, about power, about how you expect people to interact. In typical top-down organizations, I mean, we all know what the seating plan for that. You don't need me to say what the seating plan for that organization looks like. You want to change that, you smash that plan up. But then I think that there are multiple other ways around that. I mean, all cultures boil down to people. And you have to, as a leader, ultimately address whether the autocrats, if that's what it is in your organization, whether those people ultimately can or can't change, and cannot and are or aren't prepared to embrace the values of the culture that you're saying that organization needs to have. Because if they don't, it will never change. I mean, that's, to be blunt, it boils down to people's behaviors. So you can put physical change in place. I always think if you want to create change, make Monday physically feel different to Friday. But at the end of the day, culture boils down to changing behaviors. And that starts with, have you got people at the top who behave in the coherent with the culture you want?
I'm curious, what's the single biggest piece of bullshit you've been sold about leadership in your life?
I genuinely think it is the virility of a leader is your ability to define really eloquently, really cleverly, really concisely this kind of, this end point, this vision, this mission, this purpose, these whatever it is. I mean, that you can't be a leader if you haven't really spent an awful lot of time coming up with really clever, complicated answers to that question. And I know, because I spent a lot of years seeing leaders that I worked for trying to do that. And then as I find myself in leadership positions, I too start to go and try and do that. And again, to restate myself, I'm not saying you don't need to define where you're trying to get to. You absolutely need to define where you're trying to get to. It's just the objective is not to be really, really, really clever and really unique. It's in fact almost impossible to be unique in terms of finding your answer to that. What's more important is to be clear what you're trying to do, to be ambitious in what you're trying to do, and massively over communicate it so everybody else knows where it is you're trying to get to.
What advice might you give a leader who is listening to this and saying, yeah, that makes so much sense to me. I'm tired of actually trying to get clever, but I'm in an organization where clever's kind of what's expected, right? That gets rewarded because it sounds really good. What tips would you give that person?
I think being clever is fine. I think being able to be clear. My tips to that person would be not be less clever, but be more clear. The problem with people trying to appear clever is that they tend to use longer and longer sentences and bigger words. And the problem with longer and longer sentences and bigger words is maybe that
less
person
clear.
really understands it. Maybe it is really, really, really clever. But if nobody else can do anything with it and nobody else can understand it, it's useless. So I would say that the cleverest people that I've met and work with are nearly always also the clearest.
What's the next leadership challenge, small or large, facing you in the coming weeks?
Well, I mean, at the moment, I know this is not a very imaginative answer, but I can't get much further at the moment than COVID. I think it's been the most difficult time of my career, and I'm sure that's not just me. I think that's true for an awful lot of us. The big problem, of course, is not just the present. It's the almost unprecedented lack of visibility into even the medium term. So I think being able to continually get a good balance between continue to keep your eye on where you want to get to as a business or as a leader, whilst having to be a lot more nimble and a lot more agile in the medium term than ever we've had to be in the past.
Well, as an employer of many, many hundreds, not thousands of people, we wish you success with that.
Thank you.
Absolutely.
Well, Chris, thank you for doing this.
Thank you so much.
We know you're a busy guy, so good luck with the months ahead.
Thank you very much for having me. I really enjoyed it. So that was a great conversation. So thanks for your time and thanks for having me on. And lovely to meet you and love to see you again, John.
Until next time, folks, the world needs more everyday leaders, and that leader is you.